Hello, I'm Marlina Whop. I want to say, first of all, as a Gumulgal person of Malayug Island in the Torres Strait, I acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded. My respects as well to the elders. David Crisafulli is the Leader of the Opposition, Shadow Minister for Olympics and Paralympics and Shadow Minister for Tourism. He has proudly represented the people of Broadwater in the Queensland Parliament since 2017. As the son of sugarcane farmers and small business owners from Ingham in North Queensland, he saw early on the value of farming and private enterprise. This gave him a passion for service in the community. Following a career in journalism, Mr Crisafulli served as a local councillor and deputy mayor for nearly 8 years. He was elected to the Queensland Parliament and served as Minister for Local Government, Community Recovery and Resilience until 2015. As a minister, Mr Crisafulli undertook the biggest reform to local government in a generation by empowering local leaders, as well as overhauling the way Queenslanders rebuild after natural disasters. Please welcome the Leader of the Opposition, David Crisafulli.
Well, Marlina, thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you also for that lovely acknowledgement of country. Thank you very much for having me today. Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't expect to be here today. But given the situation, I'm very happy to step in. I had a fairly average rugby league career. I only ever got one intercept pass, but I'm honoured this one has come my way, and I will take it with both hands. I was last extended this opportunity by the Queensland Media Gallery to be on this stage in the middle of 2021, 2.5 years ago. 2.5 years ago, I spoke of the importance of service delivery in government and the consequences Queenslanders endure when governments get that wrong. 2.5 years ago, I warned the government they were losing control of the health system. I warned the government they were losing control of housing affordability. I warned the government they were losing control of youth crime. Unfortunately, these warnings were ignored. I wasn't the only one warning the government. Queenslanders were crying out in their thousands, and their stories have been told by many in this room today. I also warned the government about the darkening storm clouds on the horizon, Queensland's cost of living crisis. Ask yourself this for a moment. Despite all the warnings to the government in the last 2.5 years, has Queensland's health crisis, Queensland's youth crime crisis, Queensland's housing crisis and Queensland's cost of living crisis got better or worse? Sadly, as I travel the state listening to Queenslanders, I get the same answer to the one I reckon you are likely thinking in your mind at the moment. Queensland's big four crises have got worse on the government's watch. Instead of listening to the warnings, the government missed the opportunity to deal with these issues early when they denied their existence and their seriousness. Instead, they concentrated on media opportunities and, more recently, they have been fixated on an internal struggle over who should replace the Premier. With so much time and energy spent on the wrong priorities, is it any wonder the issues that matter to Queenslanders have been allowed to spiral out of control? Queenslanders are paying the cost of the chaos and crisis of the government. In the last week, we have heard two of the most sobering and troubling stories when it comes to the Queensland health crisis. A 51-year-old single mum from Forest Lake who was unable to get an ambulance in her hour of need. A Boona grandfather who waited several hours at the end of an ambulance ramp. They are the faces of the Queensland health crisis. Today, the sad reality for Queenslanders is the state government isn't focused on their priorities because after nearly a decade in power, Labor is entirely absorbed with themselves and their job prospects. Labor is a government with the wrong priorities. The result of a government focused on itself rather than Queenslanders is Queenslanders pay, and they are paying dearly. In the last week, again, we have been introduced to a service station owner called Jas from Underwood. And I listened to his story about what it is like to have to comfort his staff when thieves go marauding through that business. An honest person just wanting to make an honest living. his staff wanting to go to work and feel safe. That is the consequences of the youth crime crisis. It can't go on. Labor's chaos and crisis is costing Queenslanders in all corners of the state and in all aspects of their lives. When I first became opposition leader, I made a point of publicly stating I saw my job in two parts: holding the government accountable and charting a better way forward for the state. And this brings me to what I want to talk to you about today. Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to dive a little deeper into the LNP's blueprint for Queensland, the right priorities for Queensland's future. It is a blueprint created from the experiences and stories of the Queenslanders our team has met over the past 3 years. These experiences, listening to Queenslanders, have shaped our priorities. This is our team's blueprint to deliver on those priorities, to prove to Queenslanders that the LNP has the right priorities for Queensland's future. Our priorities are Queenslanders' priorities, and we are focused on a better way for them. This blueprint will guide the policies and decisions of an LNP government to ensure we deliver the right priorities for Queensland's future. The LNP's blueprint for the state focuses 5 key areas: making our community safer, easier access to healthcare, saving you paying for Labor's failures, securing our housing foundations and working harder for Queenslanders. We have outlined priorities across every area of government to return integrity to government, to restore the services Queenslanders rely on, and to manage our economy responsibly. For Queenslanders, making our community safer means more police on the beat, rewriting the Youth Justice Act, and reforming early intervention programs to give wayward youth the support they need to turn their lives around. For Queenslanders, easier access to health services means driving down ambulance ramping and surgery waiting lists, as well as reopening maternity services in regional Queensland. For Queenslanders, saving you paying for Labor's failures means reducing government waste, delivering projects on time and on budget, and driving down those structural cost of living. For Queenslanders, securing our housing foundations means improving housing affordability, delivering social and community housing, increasing home ownership, including in Indigenous communities, and delivering the infrastructure needed to protect our way of life. And working harder for Queenslanders, that means governing with integrity, allowing more classroom time for teachers, empowering the public service, and ensuring that energy is affordable, reliable and sustainable. For Queenslanders, good government means having the right priorities for Queenslanders. Ladies and gentlemen, for too long, Queenslanders have been forced to endure the wrong priorities of the Labor government. But we are charting a new course, a better way. Over the coming months, we will continue to visit every corner of our state to listen to Queenslanders, their experiences and the issues that matter most to them. Our blueprint has been created by Queenslanders for Queenslanders. When I was first elected as opposition leader, I worked with members of my party from right across the state to initiate reforms that would allow Queenslanders to have confidence in our ability to govern. Even my harshest critics would have to acknowledge that. I've tried to apply that same disciplined approach to all that I do. Consult with Queenslanders, build the foundations and then work on the solutions. That is what we have done with this blueprint. We have listened to Queenslanders. It's been written by them. There are stories about them, and it's a blueprint to make things better for them. And this is how our team will approach government. First, by getting the fundamentals right. Which brings me back to what I said the last time I was here, 2.5 years ago, on this stage, the importance of service delivery in government. Ladies and gentlemen, in my view, there is nothing more fundamental to good government than service delivery and the people who deliver those services, the public service. Today, I am releasing to Queensland the LNP's vision for Queensland's public service. The LNP will build the best homegrown public service in the country. And we're going to do it with a 7-point plan to empower the public service by establishing an independent public sector commission, setting clear goals and KPIs so ministers and directors general can be held accountable, reviewing the internal complaints procedures to restore integrity, independence and procedural fairness to the process, enhancing graduate programs and opportunities, requiring that all contracts and consultancies include a substantial training professional development component to strengthen the public service, provide training and professional development to better suit public servants' individual needs, to embrace new approaches to deliver better infrastructure and better services, and finally committing to no forced redundancies. When it comes to reductions in the public service, two things stand out. Queenslanders have said unequivocally they don't want them, and equally importantly, they just don't work. A public service that is secure in its employment, empowered in its decision-making, and free to give fearless and frank advice will help a government drive more efficient projects. That'll help rein in the billions of dollars of waste that is rife with this government. The current situation in the public service is one where members do not feel valued or respected. The 2021 Working for Queensland survey, those results show how a lack of leadership is fundamentally impacting the ability of the public service to serve. 34% of public servants feel burnt out at work. 38% do not think poor performance will be appropriately addressed in the workplace. 49% think there is too much red tape in their work, and 1 in 4 don't think that their organisation is well managed. A lack of leadership, a lack of vision, and a lack of compassion. This is a government that has checked out in its 3rd term, and after 10 years in office is trying to run another scare campaign aimed at a public service that does not feel valued or respected. Professor Coldrake's review spoke of an atmosphere of fear of unwanted career impacts and loss of employment status just for giving advice. That's not fearless or frank. The report speaks of pressure from some ministerial staffers for responses that minimise problems. It speaks of ministerial staffers walking around like generals. It also speaks of discouragement from providing written advice on difficult topics, and of senior public servants directing employees to sanitise advice and alter recommendations to align what is presumed to be the minister's position. We saw a report regarding the Mango Cube email saga altered to remove comments that were damaging to the government, and a state archivist was forced out as a result. We saw an integrity commissioner bullied out of her position because she dared criticise the government. This is not the way you build a strong culture. To reform the culture in the public service, we must show that we are genuine. A public service with a strong culture feels value, it's secure in its employment, it's empowered its decision-making, and it's free to give fearless and frank advice. Professor Coldrake said in his review, the tone set at the top is essential. Today, I am setting that tone. The LNP's vision for Queensland's public service is to build the best homegrown public service in the nation. The first step is returning independence to Queensland's public service. Today I announce an LNP government will create a truly independent public sector commission. Critical to returning independence to the public service, we will be severing the link between the Premier's Department and the Public Sector Governance Council. Currently, both the Premier's Director-General and the Under-Treasurer sit on the Public Sector Governance Council alongside the Public Sector Commissioner. This will cease. Rather than serving the interests of the government of the day, public servants must have confidence the Public Sector Commission has the sole focus of making Queensland's public service the best performing one in the nation. This will signify very clearly the days of a public service where staff withhold or change advice out of fear of reprisals are over. I want to unleash the fearless and frank advice that is currently being silenced by a rotten culture by the Labor government. In government, I want to hear all the advice, the pros and the cons. And when we've considered all the advice, we will make a decision. For a public service to lead the nation, we need to create a culture where people feel proud to serve and the brightest want to join them. That is why today I can also announce an LNP government will revitalise and expand the existing graduate programs within government. This will be a program designed to attract the best and the brightest, and this is how the policy will work. Graduates will undertake a 2-year program which will consist of 4 6-monthly placements across the public service. The placements for the graduates will involve training across policy and strategy, data and digital, project management, financial acumen, legal and ethics. Each placement will be in a different capability area and likely in a different department. One of the main aims of the program is to give a more fulsome understanding of Queensland. To that end, at least one placement will be outside of Brisbane to ensure exposure to the unique issues facing regional Queenslanders. For our graduates who live in the region, we will reverse this and provide at least one placement in the capital. At the completion of the program, there will be opportunities for a 6-month rotation with industry to gain an understanding of how government impacts the private sector. Graduates will be paired with a high-performing, experienced director or executive director from the Queensland Public Service to act as their mentor. We will pair the best and brightest young minds with the best experienced talent to build the next generation of leaders. As well as undertaking the graduate rotations and delivering services for Queenslanders while doing so, all graduates will participate in a postgraduate certificate relevant to public administration. This will be a graduate certificate level qualification. It will be completed with a mix of on-the-job and structured learning. An LNP government would work with Queensland universities, TAFE and vocational providers to develop these new tailored qualifications. When graduates have finished their program and qualifications, they will be offered permanent jobs in the Queensland Public Service. It's a long-term vision to grow the public service from within, the best public service in the country. In addition to this, we must prioritise reinforcing and bolstering Queensland's frontline with nation-leading projects to attract the best and the brightest, our next generation of frontline workers. More health workers, more doctors, more nurses, more teachers, more police. I'll have more to say about that in the lead up to the election. Frontline workers are leaving under Labor. We must retain, value, empower the ones we have and attract the next generation to wrestle back control of the crises facing Queenslanders. Ladies and gentlemen, these announcements, along with our previous announcements about reducing the constant outsourcing of work to the Big Four consultancy firms and providing training to improve the capability of the public service, are foreshadowed in our blueprint. It may be curious to some in this room why I have chosen this policy area to speak about today. Why not crime? Why not housing affordability? Why not health? Why not cost of living? To that I say, I am. Without an empowered and respected homegrown public service, we will never address the Big Four crises gripping this state. Our right priorities blueprint is the roadmap to guide us through. It's the roadmap to deal with the big issues facing Queenslanders. And we achieve this by building the best homegrown public service in the country. The key to solving the chaos and crisis facing Queenslanders is to get the basics right. The deterioration of service delivery in Queensland didn't happen overnight. It's taken a long time to get here. It will take some time to fix. My opponents have mocked the idea of structural reform, but I'm not interested in a quick fix just to get through a media cycle. For too long, problems have been ignored, or they're dealt with by a press release, an announcement without follow-through. All this does is magnify the crises. To solve the crime crisis, the housing crisis, the health crisis, the cost of living crisis, Queensland needs a government at the top of its game. No one, inside or outside of the government, would claim that Labor's current performance is at the top of its game. It's a government's role to deal with the mounting crises facing a state. To do so, it will need a secure, empowered, frank and fearless public service working towards a common goal. The LNP will restore the fundamentals of government, putting an end to the issues addressing Queenslanders. To me, a critical way to further raise the capability of government is the restoration of the Queensland Productivity Commission. Governments play a fundamental role in the productivity challenges that business faces: tax, regulation, spending. Earlier this year, the Federal Productivity Commission released its 5-year review of Australian productivity. It was a 9-volume, 1,000-page document crying out for public policy improvements. Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers has talked about an opportunity to renew the Federal Productivity Commission. Past Labor luminaries, Hawke and Keating, shaped their reform agendas around Productivity Commission recommendations. Meanwhile, in Queensland, Treasurer Dick abolished our version of this institution. Originally introduced in the first term of the Palaszczuk government, the Queensland Productivity Commission had delivered a range of independent opinions, notably in relation to recidivism and imprisonment, as well as manufacturing. Tellingly, just before its abolition, the Queensland Productivity Commission released a March 2021 report on regulation. It found that Queensland businesses spend between $3.5 and $7 billion each year. That's up to $15,200 per business on compliance activities alone. This is equivalent to roughly 1 to 2% of Queensland's gross state product. On the flip side, the Productivity Commission also estimated that gross spending on administering and enforcing regulation in Queensland is likely to be in the order between $2.6 and $3.1 billion per annum. We need our own Productivity Commission to secure our future prosperity and create the jobs of tomorrow for Queenslanders. We need to minimise unnecessary regulatory impos, encourage creativity and innovation, and build a highly skilled public service to deliver more and better services. Queensland's own Productivity Commission will help us significantly in this task. After starting it in the first place, the Palaszczuk government cut the Queensland Public Productivity Commission. Now the LNP will bring it back because we believe accountability and transparency matters in government. To see the response from the state government to this policy is an entree to the fact Queenslanders will be subjected to another scare campaign from a government desperate to cling to power. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted the focus today to be largely on the future, so I will move on. Allow me now to execute the other part of my job as Leader of the Opposition, and that is to highlight the right priorities and to hold the government to account for their failings. Together with Deputy Leader Jared Blay, who, Peter, is number 7 Shadow Minister, because he is here today, and he didn't take offence by you overlooking him. Our united team has treated that role with the respect it deserves. We have travelled the state constantly to monitor the impacts of government action or inaction. We have done so with more formal arrangements, such as our Queensland Crisis Town Hall meetings, or less formal settings like door knocking, going out and meeting people at community events. It's these interactions that have guided our efforts to improve outcomes for Queenslanders. We have forced the government into backdowns on issues such as breach of bail, the renters tax, the patients tax, and now we have forced them to start talking about home ownership rates. And that is something I want to talk about for a very brief moment. While I'm grateful the Premier is now talking about home ownership, money alone is not the answer. Almost a month ago today, I announced an ambitious 10-year target for Queensland to have the highest home ownership rate in the country by 2034. I made this announcement because I wanted Queenslanders to have hope their ambition of owning a home was matched by our ambition for them. I acknowledge this is a big, bold commitment, a plan to go from last place to first within a decade. It is a commitment that will require focus and perseverance. But when I sit in a room of a couple of dozen young people, as I did in the Gold Coast recently. And I asked them how many of them would one day like to own their own home. And all bar a couple of hands went up, and there will always be people who want the flexibility of not owning their own home. But I then asked how many of you believe you will own your own home in the next decade. Almost every hand went down. Young people, engaged people, studying or working, and they don't see a way through that they will own a home in a decade. We must change that. I also announced if the LNP is elected to government, I will appoint the country's first ever Minister for Home Ownership, a single point of accountability. State governments, if brave enough, can use the tools available to help drive up home ownership. We will prioritise new tax relief options, looking at issues like transfer duty concessions for first home buyers, and investigate other threshold implications. We will prioritise building an incentive framework to support home ownership, examining areas including first homeowners grants as well as shared responsibility schemes. We will prioritise developing options to open up more land with supporting infrastructure to bolster supply lines. We will make sure that there is social and affordable housing to take the pressure off the bottom end of the market and ensure the vulnerable have a roof over their head. This is the type of ambition we need to tackle the problems facing Queensland. Ladies and gentlemen, in the next 12 months, you will see a host of fanciful claims, boogeyman stories from the government about me and the LNP and a government that by the election will be a decade in the wilderness. They will do this because the cupboard is bare. Labor has nothing more to add to a vision for the future, so instead they will fight the ghosts of the past. In contrast, the LNP has listened to the judgment of Queenslanders, and we have the right priorities for Queensland's future. Expect us to ignore these scare campaigns and roll out more policies that align with this document. We will do it in a disciplined way, a way that gives assurances to Queenslanders they have been created to address the issues that matter to them, a way that demonstrates we are working to make Queensland better for the next generation and not just until the next election, a way that proves we have the right priorities for Queensland's future. I finish today with this message. Queensland can have a bright future. We can still deliver on the unwritten promise from one generation to the next that we leave things better than we found it. To make good on this promise, we must confront problems, not ignore them. Acknowledge them, not deny them. The problems Queensland's face are deep-seated, multifaceted, and long in the making. Currently, by any objective standard, the government has lost its way. No less a judge than Prime Minister Albanese said, governments don't get better in their fourth term. I believe all Queenslanders know in their hearts this government will not get better. They know the best days of the Premier are behind her, and they know the challenges nipping at her heels are those who have caused most of her problems. They know we need to change to a government that has the right priorities for Queensland's future. I will work every waking hour to give Queenslanders the confidence to make that change in 2024. I return to the question I posed at the start of this address, the one that Queenslanders will ask themselves in a year. Have the big four crises got better or worse under Labor's watch, and who has the right priorities for Queensland's future? Thank you all very much for your time.
All right, so we're going to throw to some questions from journalists soon. At the back of the room, there are a couple of roving microphones, so stand by. But first of all, you spoke about Labor having to fight ghosts from the past. There were thousands of job losses in the public service under the Newman government. You were a minister in that government. Is your announcement today an admission that you got it wrong?
It's an announcement for every Queenslander that we must deliver the services they need. And it's an announcement that it was wrong and it didn't work. And in order to deliver that turnaround in the services, we need the public service to feel valued and respected. And we need them to feel empowered and safe in their jobs. And right now, the challenge that Queenslanders tell me about are the big four crises I raised. The only way you will turn that around is with an empowered public service. So today is about making sure that the public service do see that there is a better way, that they are part of the solution to those challenges facing Queenslanders, and they are going to be respected and valued.
Why should, though, public servants trust you again?
Because we have learnt and we have acknowledged and reflected the result. And Queenslanders spoke. And you've got to acknowledge that, and you have to learn from that. And in the same way that the Labor government have learnt from the broken promise of selling assets, we have learnt from this. And we have to get a public service that feels valued and respected. And when I read Professor Coldrake's review, I see a culture that is rotten, and they need to know that they are going to be part of the solution, and they need to know that they're going to be respected. And Queenslanders need to know that there is a better way when it comes to the services that they rightly expect and deserve.
Can we expect numbers or job targets, and how much is this plan going to cost? How are you going to pay for these promises?
Marlina, I've highlighted before that the wanton outsourcing to the big four consultancies in the last 5 years alone has cost north of $400 million. Now, there is a role for the big four consultants. They have a level of expertise that we must use, but it can't be always outsourcing, and it can't be without an upskilling of the public service when that occurs. The graduate programs I'm talking about will be far, far less expensive than the constant outsourcing to the big four. I think this can actually empower and bolster a public service. I also think it's financially responsible too. Likewise, I want the public service to understand what business require in a focused, empowered public service. And that's why I want to have a greater interaction between business and the public sector. We've got to grow the economy. We've got to make sure that Queensland can be that economic engine room. There were some numbers out today from the ABS that make for sober reading. And it shows that we've all got to be in this together. Everyone's got to have one focus, one common goal. And it's important that the public service have a focus that they're going to be part of that turnaround.
So there will be extra jobs created, but you don't know how many?
Well, we need more doctors, more nurses, more teachers. I think that's a given. When you look at the health crisis and you see ambulance ramping has gone from 15% to 43% in the last 8 years, that's the worst in the country. There is no way you can turn that around without more nurses, without more doctors. It just won't happen. When you look at the missed targets when it comes to the promises the government made for more teachers, we need to have more teachers. At the last election, the government promised 1,450 additional frontline full-time equivalent police officers. There are 202 less today than 12 months ago. So that promise is not going to be met. So we need more frontline staff. What I'm talking about is an empowered public service across the board. And part of my focus is to make sure that we do create that next generation of leaders as well. That there is no way out of the crises facing Queenslanders without a public service that is focused on turning that around. And if you read Coldrake's review, it shows that they are yearning for leadership. And I want to be part of that.
All right, we will be throwing to questions now from my colleagues. Who have we got first?
Hi, Rachel Rieger from the ABC. David, if the LNP wins government next year, do you commit to no new or increased taxes, and will you be scrapping progressive coal royalty tiers?
Rachel, thanks very much for the question. We'll be outlining a full tax plan ahead of the election, as every government does. Just on the latter, because I've seen a 12-month or nearly an 18-month now scare campaign from the Treasurer. On 2 occasions, we've had to vote for the next 4 years of those taxes. On 2 occasions, we've supported them. We will do so again on the third term. On the third time, there is no doubt whatsoever that it was a broken promise. 26 times a broken promise. Once by Marlina when it was asked directly, does that include increased taxes? And the answer was no. Well, 26 times. We've had 5 since the election. So I'll tell you one thing. The tax plan that we go to the election with, people will be able to take it to the bank. They will be able to trust it. They will be able to value it, and it will matter. Now, in the next budget, we'll be outlining for the next 4 years, and ahead of the election, our full tax plan will be released. It'll be responsible, it will be affordable, and it will provide the services that Queensland needs. Queenslanders need world-class services, and they're going to get it.
Thanks, David. Hayden Johnson. You promised no forced redundancies. We know the public sector wages bill is now $32.1 billion and it's climbed 2% higher than the previous year. Can you rule out any voluntary redundancies or natural attrition in middle management, particularly in those non-frontline roles?
Hayden, the government's been embarking on that process for the last few years. My focus is on making sure that the public service feel respected and valued. And when I look at the public service and I look at the services that are being delivered, the answer is we actually need to attract more. And you can't get away from that. The numbers show that. Every target the government has set for a public service to deliver the services haven't been met. So it's just not our priority. Our priority is to get service delivery going. And if we can get service delivery going, we can get the economy going. If we can get certainty on taxation and regulation, we can get business going. That's how you get an economic revival. That's how you build a long-term strategy. Deliver the infrastructure on time and on budget, have a public service that feels respected and empowered to be part of that solution, grow the economic pie, stabilise the debt, which at the moment is careering towards $150 billion. That's how you achieve outcomes.
David, Adam Walters from Sky News. The IOC has already been on the record saying that a city's qualification to stage the Olympic Games is not contingent upon brand new stadiums. Given the cost of living pressures in Queensland and your capacity as the Shadow Olympics Minister, do you think Queenslanders find palatable the $2.7 billion that's been committed to knocking down and replacing a perfectly good arena at the Gabba?
Thanks, Adam. Firstly, we are 100% behind the Olympics. It's a golden opportunity to provide a 20-year tourism plan, an infrastructure delivery plan. Unfortunately, in the last 2 years since we secured the Games, the focus has drifted away from that. It has been all about the event and all about stadiums. So the first thing we're going to do is re-establish an independent infrastructure delivery authority. That is a non-negotiable. Every level of government needs to have skin in the game. We need to have the best and brightest around that. That was the initial decision behind the bid, and the government has walked away from it and made it a vanity project, if we're being honest. Now, I don't know what the costings are for the Gabba. We were told $1 billion, and then we were told $2.7 billion. So we want to see what the costings are. And when we get the costings, we will release them. We deserve a world-class oval stadium, no doubt about it. We just want to see what those business cases are. And the fact that the government haven't released either, in my mind, leaves Queenslanders very, very curious. But I repeat, the focus of the Olympics should be about rail, road, 20-year tourism vision. That's what it's about, getting all levels of government onto the table. That has to be the focus, not on sporting facilities. That must be the focus.
Hello, Mr. Crisafulli. It's Lydia Lynch from The Australian. I've got a long one for you. So currently in Queensland, abortion is legal on request up to 22 weeks, and there's no requirement for women to have mandatory counselling if they're seeking an abortion. You've repeatedly said that changes to the Termination of Pregnancy Act aren't your priority, they're not on your agenda, they're not your focus. But given that you withdrew support for treaty laws after facing sustained pressure from within your party for months, and also given that abortion has been been quite a divisive topic within the Liberal National Party for years. There's naturally questions around whether this will become a priority for you or it will be on your agenda after a few years in government. So today, can you guarantee that there will be no changes to the Termination of Pregnancy Act, including lowering those gestation limits or introducing mandatory counselling under a Crisafulli government?
Well, let me be really clear. It is not a priority. And you've said that, you've asked me many times, it is not a priority. My priority are the things that are in this book, and they are the priorities that Queenslanders have told me about. So it is not on the agenda. On the other issue about treaty, it's very rare that you get an opportunity to reflect a position taken by every single person. An election or a referendum. They're the only two opportunities you get. I looked at it, I saw the level of vitriol during the debate, I saw what Queenslanders said and how they reflected, and I did not want to make the same mistake that Mr Albanese made, magnified over a longer period. So I said we are determined to try and find another way to bring the change to Indigenous communities. And I am determined to do that. I've been in every Indigenous community in this state and I see disadvantage. I see overcrowding in houses. I see kids not having the opportunities to go to school, get a job, and as I said in the speech, own a home. And I'm not convinced that people who live in Indigenous communities shouldn't have the opportunity one day to be able to transfer to home ownership. And I'm focused on that. But my decision regarding that came out because of a referendum, which is a very, very specific and very rare opportunity. But on your question, it is just not a priority.
Yes, but just saying something isn't your priority doesn't mean that you'll guarantee there'll be no changes. So just back on my question, can you guarantee there'll be no changes to the Act under your government?
Well, if I say it's not a priority, there's not going to be changes because I've got a whole shopping list of things that need to be fixed. And if I've said to Queenslanders what they want me to be focused on, I'll tell you what they will say. They want to see an end to the feeling of completely insecurity at home. They want to see an end to not being able to get an ambo because that hard-working paramedic stuck on the end of the ramp waiting for a hospital bed to open up. They want to see an end to working people living out of their car, and they want to know that they can afford their electricity bill. It is not a priority. So it couldn't be more definitive. That is our focus. The things in that book are our Bible that will drive us. So the answer is no.
No changes for 4 years.
No
Guaranteed.
changes for 4 years. It is not a priority. Our priority are the things that Queenslanders have told us are their priorities.
Thanks.
Brendan Smith from 10 News First. Just sticking to the abortion reform and the chat around that, in terms of having a candidate like Amanda Stoker, who's been a very loud voice in the anti-abortion space, she's publicly attended Cherish Life rallies. How can you have someone like that in your party who won't be keen to put it on the agenda and to see change put through? And do you think having a candidate with those views will potentially alienate younger voters?
Well, the joy about our political movement, Brendan, is that we have a diversity of opinions, ages, backgrounds, and we are stronger for it. And I embrace the fact that we have a diversity of a party room. But it's not a priority, and it's not a priority for her voters either. Her voters, I believe, would say the same thing that my voters do, and that is they want us to focus on this. And that is the blueprint I'm taking to the election. So I can't be any more definitive about that. It is not a priority. Our priority are to address these issues. And at the time of the next election, it's going to be a really big test for us, and that is, have things got better when it comes to health, housing, youth crime and cost of living? Because I know the answer to the last decade. All four of those things have deteriorated. And I believe I know the answer to who has the right priorities to fix them. But in 4 years' time, if we're given the opportunity in 2028, I have to have, as part of a team, address those four issues. Queenslanders have to see a turnaround in those four issues. Not one, in the four issues. And that is going to be our focus every single day.
David, Tim Harvey of 9 News. I know you've spoken about how Labor will try to make you out to be the bogeyman, and you don't want to go down the road of history looking back. But just doing that for a second, because
well, I said boogeyman, but as a golfer, you say bogey. But carry on.
We'll leave that debate till later. Campbell Newman promised higher wages in the public service and a leaner public service. He then got into government and then said, now we've had a look over the books, Queensland has 20,000 more public servants than we can afford. At the moment, you've got no tax plan that you are saying publicly. There's no costings for this. Is there any indication that you can give to people in this room about how you're going to fund this plan and how much it will cost?
We'll have a fully costed plan before the election, and it'll be scrutinised, as it always is for every opposition. But I repeat what I said before. It didn't work. Queenslanders spoke, and you have to acknowledge. You have to acknowledge that and reflect on it. That's the way to delivering better government. Equally, I'm focused on making sure that we can create an economic engine room that people can benefit from. And we will have a tax plan ahead of the next election. And by the way, if the government would embark on things like a parliamentary budget office that other jurisdictions have, policies would be able to be costed across the political divide. But that promise has repeatedly been shut down. Every time we have pointed out to the government that they have broken that promise, it gets kicked into the never-never. I believe a parliamentary budget office is an important part of democracy. I also believe that a proper functioning estimates process is important to democracy. And they are things that we intend to take into our term in government to make sure that we are held accountable. It matters.
Would you describe yourself as a friend of the public service now?
I'm your friend.
That wasn't the question I asked.
Well, Tim, I tell you what, I know the value that comes with people feeling empowered and respected in their jobs. I know what it feels like to not have that, and I know what it feels like as a Queenslander to believe that the services that they're getting aren't up to scratch. And I know how much that hurts the public service. When I speak to doctors and nurses, they are the ones reaching out to us, crying out for help. Imagine what it's like to get another text message, and Ros Bates is here today, got a text the other day from a supervisor showing a text back from a nurse saying, I just can't do another shift of overtime, I'm broken. Imagine what that's like, having to make a decision whether or not you go home and try and have a sleep in the knowledge that maybe someone's going to die on a ramp, or whether or not to go in and try and do the shift again. If we don't address the issue of service delivery, Queenslanders will rightly say we have failed if we're given the opportunity to govern. And I want a public service that feels like they are valued and respected. And I want them to know that they're going to be part of the turnaround, a big part of the turnaround.
Hi, David. Fraser Barton from Australian Associated Press. You've touched on treaty already, and you said you're committed to housing in First Nations communities and betterment for First Nations communities. What do those policy measures look like, and will you accept recommendations from crossbenchers about local voices within these communities?
It looks like the kids who grow up in those communities having the same opportunity that the kids of the people in this room have. That's what it looks like. And the level of disadvantage in those communities is gut-wrenching. But there are some green shoots. And when I go into a place like Cherbourg, I see those green shoots. I see a council that has embarked on real economic opportunities. I see a council that's now got a call centre that is providing services to the private sector. I see a recycling facility that doesn't just recycle their waste, does the waste for the entire region. Real jobs. Both of them are real jobs. There are opportunities. I still think the fundamental greatest gift that can happen is the ability for a pathway to home ownership. And I know that's difficult, but it matters to me. And it matters to me that that can occur. And that was something that we had embarked on in our short period of time in government, and by even the most generous of standards, in the last 9 years, it has not delivered what it should have. And I'm determined to make sure it does. And I want these people in these communities to have hope and opportunity. And I'm determined to do that. And we have to find a way to make sure that that occurs.
Just on that, there were more than a dozen Indigenous councils who wrote to you and in their words said that they were hurt by your change of position on the path to treaty and truth-telling. You supported that in Parliament in May, then you changed your mind. I guess on the issues of trust, transparency, integrity, which you talk a lot about, why should people trust you on any future policies and commitments that you make in the lead up to the election?
That was a referendum, and good leaders.
But it was a referendum on the voice and something different, not on your position on treaty.
I think if you watch the tone of that debate and if you listen to what Queenslanders said, I think there was a very, very clear view. And what I didn't want to do is to reopen another 6 months, the likes of which we'd seen in the 6 months previous. And the Prime Minister was warned repeatedly, and he should have listened. And I was determined not to make the same mistake. Equally, I am determined to be held accountable for what happens in Indigenous communities and what opportunities afforded to Indigenous Australians. And I'm determined to do that. And I'm a big believer, and one of the things I mentioned in our 7-point plan for the public service is KPIs for Directors General and Ministers. I want to see that. I don't want a culture where nobody is held accountable. I don't want a culture where somebody can blow $2.4 billion, hide it, and then there's a sorry without any consequences. That has to change. There has to be accountability. And if we have accountability, we can turn things around in Indigenous communities. And I'm determined to find another way. And I'm determined to work with those mayors to do that. And I hope that the success that every single Queenslander experiences is not limited to every single Queenslander who lives in Brisbane. It's got to be every single Queenslander across the board.
All right, we have a couple of minutes left for questions.
Hi, Eden Gillespie from The Guardian. Just curious to know what your renewable energy targets will be ahead of the election and your emission reduction targets. Will they be more ambitious than the current government's?
Well, I've already said that I'm committed to net zero by 2050. And more than that, I'm committed to making sure that there are targets to deliver that. That's important to me. And I think there's economic opportunities if we get that right as well. I genuinely do. I think there's some great economic opportunities for Queensland. We're well placed for that, and we intend to be part of that journey towards it.
Mr. Crisafulli, Dennis Atkins in Queensland. I'm unashamedly an inner city dweller. My life revolves around the 199 bus. Now, at the west end of the 199 bus is a fantastic service called Micah Projects that works with the homeless in inner city Brisbane. And Karen Walsh at Micah tells me that one of the big changes that has occurred over the last couple of years has been a change from homeless individuals, men and women, to homeless families, where they are now getting through their doors dozens of families coming month after month. What have you? Now we've read your plans for home ownership, and they're all terrific, and hope they succeed. But what are your plans? What are your ideas for the scourge of homelessness, especially in the big cities? It's not just Brisbane. It's happening in the regions as well, where people just don't have a place to live. They don't have a roof over their head.
Dennis, we have to do something to turn it around, and it means social housing and community housing has to be delivered, and there has to be targets set on both. In the last 8 years, Queensland is the only state in the country that has gone backwards in community housing, the only one. In the same period, New South Wales have added somewhere in the order of about 25,000 community housing dwellers. Now, there is a sector that I want to work with and empower and give them the ability to lever their balance sheet to be able to deliver more for people. There's a wonderful organisation in Townsville I've had involvement with over many years called Yumba Meta. They provide an amazing service for Indigenous Australians. I want to see organisations like that truly unleashed. When it comes to social housing, targets must be set. They must be met. 2 years ago, the government announced a $2 billion fund that was going to build social housing. At the time of the next election, 3 years on, that fund will have built 34 properties. 34 in 3 years. We've got to set targets and ministers have to be held accountable. In answer to your question, you're right. We can't turn our back on the vulnerable, and that means things like mental health funding also has to be coupled in with that. There's a real issue with vulnerable people. But you hit the nail on the head when you talk about families. I met a family the other day, husband and wife, 3 kids under 5. He's had the same job for 7 years, and they've had the same home for 8 years. They were given a reasonably good amount of warning from the landlord who was selling the property, and they gave him a bit of time. They were very generous for that. They wanted to find something around that area. It was in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. They looked. Eventually, they ran out of time. I met them living in their car. At 7 o'clock in the morning, they take the kids out of the car into the tent, and he drives to work with their car. He's paying tax. He's a working Queenslander, and he was living out of his car. Now, we're better than that as a society. So I'm not going to suggest for one moment there's not a real issue with the chronic underfunding of housing for the vulnerable. There is, and we're going to have some pretty ambitious targets when it comes to that, and I speak about that mental health capacity as well. But we have to find a way when it comes to working people living out of their cars and people who are dreading their lease renewal coming up. And I know there's been a lot of different ideas floated around, but in the end, the fundamentals are you do need more supply. And we've had 30% less lots over the last decade, and it does not make sense. You've got to increase supply to the market. That is the only way you stop the feeding frenzy at the bottom end of the market, and social and community housing are part of that. If you address that, you address the craziness that occurs where working people can't afford a home.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question.
Afternoon, Matt Deneen from Brisbane Times. You've spoken in your speech here today about the big 4 crises as you described them. The independent Noosa MP Sandy Bolton, who's heading this new bipartisan youth justice committee, has said she doesn't think crisis is quite the right word to describe what's going on there. Many of the other issues that you're pointing to feature, national and global pressures as well. Given your comments around the Voice and Treaty and wanting to avoid division and looking ahead at better futures and this kind of long-running decline in public trust in politicians and institutions, and I think some of the results we saw last week around the Scanlon, the social cohesion study, do you consider it helpful, or do you think it's helpful to be using words like crisis, chaos to describe what's going on?
Matt, it's accurate, and it's the standard that we're going to be held to if we're given the opportunity to govern. So let's unpack a few of those. If you are in Queensland, you are 3 times more likely to have your car stolen than if you live in New South Wales. That's a crisis. And it's a crisis to the young families, including Will, who's in this book here, who woke up and saw his car missing. It's a crisis to them. If you are in Queensland, you nearly have a 1 in 2 chance of being stuck at the end of an ambulance ramp, 43%. That is the worst in the nation. That is a crisis. In Queensland, rents have gone up by 9.5%. That's the biggest lift in the country. That is a crisis. So when I talk about the pressures, and I unpacked housing a moment ago, they are magnified here. And I mentioned about my desire to lift the home ownership rate. There is no justification why Queensland has the lowest home ownership rate in the country. We're neither the smallest, neither the biggest. For some reason, we have found a way to find ourselves at the bottom of that pile. There is no reason why we should be last in those metrics. And I don't accept that we aren't the best. And I want to set a standard. So we've labelled them, the media's labelled them, Queenslanders have labelled them, and we will be held accountable to them. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity, if we do get it, to be able to turn it around. And in 5 years' time, the question that Queenslanders will ask is the same question they will ask now. Is my life better or worse when it comes to the health crisis, the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis and the youth crime crisis? And I'm confident the answer will be a different one in 5 years' time than what it will be in a year.
Just a really quick one, Marlina, sorry. Just to clarify on Eden's question about the renewable energy targets, Mr Crisafulli, the government's introduced a bill to Parliament to legislate the targets 50% by 2030, 70% by 2032 and 80% by 2035. Will you be voting in support of those targets?
Lydia, I've always said I never make comments on legislation while it's going through the committee process. I never have. I always look at it. We do it in a sober and a judicious way. We'll take it to Shadow Cabinet and we'll make an informed position. That's the way that good oppositions work. I have never made knee-jerk comments. My position has always been consistent from day one. I know at times that makes boring copy for you, but it's consistent. And I think it's the way that I like to conduct myself, and it's the way that I hope to get the opportunity to run a government by.
Well,
you consider things.
They announced those targets a year ago. You still don't have a position on whether or not you support them?
Well, there's legislation before the House. So let the committee process do its bit and let our Shadow Cabinet operate the way that it should.
Okay, so you're undecided there.
I have never given you an answer about legislation before the House before it's been considered by Shadow Cabinet. I've always been consistent on that.
All right, thank you for all of those questions, and that brings us to the conclusion of the luncheon, and it's our last for the calendar year. Please join me in thanking the Leader of the Opposition, David Crisafulli. As you may know, Mr Crisafulli stepped in at short notice following the late cancellation from Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk. The Premier has since agreed to address the club early in the new year on February the 6th, and tickets are now on sale on the Queensland Media Club website. It's an event the Media Gallery is looking forward to. I'd once again like to acknowledge our naming rights partners, Brisbane Airport Corporation, Before You Dig Australia and Griffith University, as well as our other event partners. Thank you all for coming, and the Queensland Media Club looks forward to seeing you at future events. If you haven't already, please sign up on the mailing list. There's a QR code on the back of the menu cards on your tables. See you soon. Thank you.